Thank you, Howard. This was very, very interesting. I'm very happy that you did touch the issue of the community and community neglect. And now, Dr. Kרמית from Tel Aviv University will talk about child neglect in Israel.
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm very happy to be here today and to share this important symposium on child neglect with my honorable colleagues. And I want to talk to you today about child neglect in Israel, and I will do it from three aspects. In the first one, I will address how social services, and specifically how social workers contend with child neglect and what are the main challenges. In the second aspect, I will try to capture the children's experiences and perception following child neglect. And in the third aspect, I will try to talk about possible solution of intervention and prevention in Israel. So I will talk really briefly about the data because Professor Dobovich already elaborated on this, but there are three main issues that I want to emphasize on those data. So the first one, actually as you can see those two columns, the left one is the report of Child Protective Services, okay? And the right one is the thorough study that was conducted by Professor Isaacovich and Professor Lewiesel. So there are three important issues that I want to emphasize. The first one is that child neglect in Israel, as in other countries, is the most evident form of maltreatment, okay? So although we have 37%, and Professor Dobovich talked on the US on 78%, but maybe the gaps are because of identification issues, but this is one issue. The second issue that I want to emphasize is the gap that we have between the reports to Child Protective Services and what children actually reported on the self-report. And we know about this gap from previous literature that say that usually the rates of disclosure to the formal authorities are much lower than what actually happens in real life. So this is the second issue that I want to emphasize. And the third one is, as you can see in the Triana report, the comparison between Jewish and Arab children. So we found much higher rates of neglect among Arab children, and I will further elaborate on it later on. So the first aspect of child neglect in Israel, the challenges for social worker. And this piece I conducted with my partner, Hannah Slutsky, who is the National Child Protective Officer in Israel. And we try to map what kinds of challenges we have. So the first one is the identification of neglect, okay? And we know that this is quite similar to other countries as well. So it's very hard to understand and to identify what child neglect is, because many times children who are neglected come to our knowledge as social workers only where there are severe consequences, when the neglect can be seen on them. And many times, especially with emotional neglect, we cannot see any sign. We cannot see the neglect on the child, and therefore we don't have this child under our supervision and our treatment. The second challenge is the cultural diversity, which in Israel, as well as other countries, we deal with a lot of other groups of cultural, and this has a lot of barriers for the social workers, because if we, as social workers, and sorry for tell that all of you social workers, maybe not all of you. I live in a world of social workers, that's why I'm we and us. But we as social workers, we want to intervene in a sensitive way, in a respectful way towards those families. It's very hard. Many times we don't know, we can't tell when to draw the line. When this is, I think it's neglect, but for this specific family, this is how they raise children. And that takes us to the third challenge about localities. So we know there is a tremendous gap in social services in different localities in Israel, and systematic studies pointing to this very important issue. So we have gaps in reports of child maltreatment in different localities in Israel, and this is another thing that we need to take in mind. Another issue is working with the parents. So we know in other countries as well how difficult it can be because we're trying to establish partnership with the parents. But there is also, we bear in mind the paradox of empowerment. How can I establish partnership without enforcing the power relation that already exists between us as practitioners and as formal authorities and the parents, and without blaming them, just becoming their partners? And that brings us to the last point on this aspect, second and third generation of neglect. This is something that we can see in our social services, a child who becomes a parent of child neglect, who becomes a grandfather of a child neglect, and this causes to a lot of frustration, both to the children, the families, and to us, our professionals who are trying to contend with this phenomenon. So the second aspect that I promised to talk about is when I'm trying to capture child neglect, I think the thing that most important is to put the child perception and the children's voices in center. And what I will explain now is a study I've conducted with my colleagues in the Service of Investigative Interviews, Dr. Untitled, the Service of the Child Forensic Investigation in Israel, and Michal Brightman, the National Inspector. And the study was approved by Galit Vygotsky-Moore, who is the president of the Child Court in Israel. And the main aim was to identify key themes within the children's narrative in order to shed light on the children's experiences and perceptions following neglect. So thematic analysis was carried on 7 forensic investigations that were conducted with children following suspected neglect. The sample included 7 children, aged 7 to 14. We had 4 boys and 3 girls who were referred for forensic investigation by CPS following evidence pointing on suspected neglect by their biological parents. And we had external evidence for all of their stories. So we found the following key categories from the children's narratives. Difficulties in providing the allegation. In a minute, I will elaborate on each one of them. The neglected incidents. The loyalty to the parents. Siblings' relationship. And hopes for the future. In difficulties in providing the so-called allegation, all the children displayed difficulties in identifying the alleged neglect. The difficulties were embedded in the challenge to retrieve and identify incident from a daily routine, like one of the children said. I don't know why you're asking me if something bad happened to me. Bad things happening to me every day. More on the providing the allegation, when the children understood that they were supposed to talk about something that happened in their homes with their own parents, they often pointed to the strong points of their parents. For example, did someone tell you about the watermelon my father bought us yesterday? We had a really great time and we were not hungry at all that day. So the forensic interviewer trying to focus on the allegation, but the child fighting to focus on the parents' abilities and good aspects. So the second theme was the neglected incidents, and when the children started to elaborate on the alleged neglect, their narratives revealed, Daddy is using drugs. When the policeman came, Daddy told us to put the drugs into our underwear. Are you asking me if I ate something today? Well, I did not. But last week, I went to a birthday party, and I had lots of sweets. At our home, the refrigerator is empty. The loyalty to the parents, spontaneously, the children elaborated on the neglected incident while stressing their love and loyalty to their parents. Few narratives, for example. After the policeman went, my daddy cried and asked us for forgiveness. My heart is aching when I see how sad Daddy is. My mom should not suffer. She deserves to be happy. Sibling relationship. The element that was most evident in the children's narratives was their strong connection to their siblings. All the children use the terms we and us in their narratives. The children elaborated on their siblings' emotion and thought much more than on their own. For example, we are going to sleep with no food, and it is hard to sleep. My little siblings are crying, and I'm trying to make them laugh. But it is hard because I'm worried about my mom, who is working all night without food. Hopes for the future. The children's hopes and desires for the future were spontaneously reported by them while talking to the forensic interviewers. And I want to take a minute to elaborate on it because we will talk about the narratives of the children, because it's not something that we should overlook. It's very unique what's happening here in Israel with the child forensic investigation. So in Israel, in comparison to other countries, the meeting with the child forensic investigation is a meeting with the social workers, which emphasize the meeting not only on the forensic process, not only about case finding and providing detail and rich testimony, but it also a meeting with the practitioner who care for you, who want to promote your well-being, who want to look on your needs, and that is why we can gather a lot of information from those children's narrative. So that's what the children told me. I don't have to eat, just sometimes. I love being with my mother when she is happy, so I hope you will help her not to be sad. Please tell the policeman that Daddy loves us and he won't do that again. He is very sad and he needs to be at home because we need him. And it was important to me to put in center the children's perspective because we cannot move to the last piece about intervention and prevention before understanding that we cannot do any intervention and any prevention in all forms of child maltreatment, of course in child neglect, without putting in the center the voices of the children, their needs, their experiences, their perceptions. And I think it's very important to put the parents' voices in the center as well. And this is another piece that we're trying to do right now, to talk to the parents. And I really believe in what you say. Maybe both of us naive, but I hope not. That parents don't want to harm the children. Most of them don't want that. They love the children. They feel frustration, terrible frustration out of this process. So it's really important for me to hear those voices and maybe to put them in the center as well and to try to understand all the intervention and prevention when we not overlooked on their voices. So the last aspect will be the intervention of child neglect in Israel. So observing policy perspective in Israel reveals a primary reliance on case finding when children are identified and possibly neglected, with most of the resources directed to the strategy of report response rather than families and community services, and much less resources to prevention. And I want to take the opportunity and talk to you today about possible solution for child neglect and child maltreatment, which call strong communities. And I'm very fortunate to collaborate on this initiative with בילדים Arad, who is professor at Aviv University, with Gary Melton, who is the father of this initiative in the US, and Jill McClay, who is a great partner to us, and of course, Asher Ben Aryeh. This initiative is part of his vision, and he brought this to Israel. And currently, we disseminate it in neighborhood in south of Tel Aviv. And I have here my amazing partner, Efrat. Sorry for, but she's a social worker in Tel Aviv municipality, and she's helping us to lead this project. And just a bit on what this initiative is. So you talked about community, and this is a bit of an answer. It has become far easier to pick up the telephone to report one's neighbor for child abuse or neglect than it is for the neighbor to pick up the telephone to request and receive help before the abuse or during the neglect happens. So it's important to understand that neighborhoods matters. Neighborhoods, it's not just physical boundaries. It's not just where you all live. It's physical indicators of neighborhood identity and well-being are strongly related to young children's safety. We also know that neighbors attempt to isolate themselves through symbolic barriers, like a chained dog in the yard, שלט של תתרחקו, יש כלב, Okay? So those symbolics are strong related to children's safety. When they are less safety for the children. And those effects are observable even when the residents' income and education are statistically controlled. So basically, what I love about strong community initiative, that it's not provide us practical guidelines or protocol. A, do that. B, do that. C, do that. No, it gives us values and vision and basic principle as follows. So we're talking about people should be able to get help where they are, when they need it, with ease and without stigma. It means that people shouldn't have to ask. It means that family shouldn't have to become patients, clients, or cases in order to receive help. We're talking about universal intervention because being a parent, I think it's hard for everyone, okay? And every child and every parent should know that whenever they have reason to celebrate, worry, or grieve, someone will notice and someone will care. And I will end that the ultimate goal of strong communities is building strong communities with no families left outside. And I will finish with a sentence of the vision. We must tear down the walls that divide us by race, class, and age. We must create caring communities that support families and shelter for children. We must take the time to see the need and lend a hand. So thank you so much for listening, and please join us for our initiative. We can do it.